Chapter 24. Proud owner of real estate and pregnant. I was crushed because I had returned to my job in the Sky Club during the weekends, whereupon Neville was more than pleased. But to sleep in Marian's apartment during the day, I couldn't even think of it. Although I stayed in the club on Fridays and Saturdays from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning, because Neville passed more and more tasks to me. I not only did the cash, but the entire settlement, and also paid the staff. However, this was not the limit. It would still get worse. 3 weeks after our return, Kathy withdrew very early into the children's bedroom, but shortly thereafter, Marion came rushing into the living room and told me, "Please come with me to see Kathy. I think she has to tell you something." I was very shocked and told her to speak with you. I looked to Robert, but he let out no reaction, so I followed Marion into the nursery and found Kathy totally dissolved in tears. I sat down beside her and asked, "What happened, Kathy? Why are you crying?" The story I heard then was so incredible that I doubted much on Kathy until I found out the truth myself. The very same day Marion and I left for Ghana, Robert had taken a young woman in the apartment with whom he had shared Marion's bedroom and who resided during our departure permanently in the apartment. Kathy couldn't stand it and ran away, but was promptly arrested by the police, who brought her initially to a children's home. She had given the number of Marion's telephone, whereupon the people had called up Robert. He, though, refused to pick up Kathy and wouldn't have even been allowed to do so. Without valid documents, they would never have entrusted Kathy to him. Therefore, Kathy had spent 2 days in this home until Heike, the name of this woman, picked her up by some excuse. Afterwards, Robert and this Heike were probably having a dispute, and the woman had left the apartment. Kathy had received money from Robert to keep her mouth shut. I was stunned. Marion interjected, "I know this Heike." I looked at her in horror and asked, "You know this Heike and have said nothing all this time?" This story was for me too outrageous to be true. I came to suspect that Marion and Kathy, getting on very well with each other, had made it all up to separate me and Robert. It would have been typical for Kathy. Of course, I asked Robert to task, but he denied everything, and my suspicions intensified. You know exactly how Kathy is, and how often she makes a big problem out of jealousy. She invented it all to separate us. I was angry with Kathy and also with Marion. My first reaction was against Kathy. "Why are you doing this, Kathy? Why are you lying?" My anger grew so intense that I threatened to give her to her home, since I no longer could endure the problems with her. But Marion also got her share. "And you doing it out of jealousy and envy, because Robert is here but Prince is not. That is your problem, right?" A certain doubt remained, however, and this grew the more often Marion started with the story. "Rita, Kathy is telling the truth. This Heike even has a child with Robert, a son who should now be about 2 months old." I had enough. "Marion, stop that shit. If it is true that she had been here, then please tell me, where was the small baby?" I simply didn't want to hear any of this anymore, and the atmosphere between all of us became unbearable. Marion didn't give up. When Prince was still here, we received the phone call of this Heike, letting Robert know that he had become a father of a son. Prince had told me this, and Robert went to see her immediately after the notification. "Didn't you say Robert was away sometimes a week or 2? And he told you earlier that he was then in England. Those times he always stayed with Heike." I don't know her personally, only by her calls and what Prince told me. From Prince, I also know that she lives quite a distance away from Hamburg. I recalled in mind when he had disappeared the last time. It was, if I wasn't mistaken, truly coinciding with the time Marian talked about, but it still didn't convince me. Can you somehow locate her address? Marian thought. Then she suddenly ran into her bedroom and came back after a few minutes with her booklet in her hand. This is the address book of Prince. Perhaps the address is inside. We searched and found Heike Meyer, street, house number, and telephone. She lived in a village near Cuxhaven at the North Sea. When Robert came home from work, he was commissioned to look after the children. Without any comment, Marian and I went towards Cuxhaven. This was not about Robert. It was my aim to rehabilitate Kathy, or to condemn her for lying. I drove more than 2 hours, and it took almost another hour until we finally interrogated us to the address. Then I stood before the woman who confirmed Kathy's story completely. When I saw Robert's son, it needed only one look to know who the father was. She had named the baby Steve. A nice name for this cute baby. I was almost jealous. Heike told us that Robert also lied to her, and only from Kathy she had learned he was living with me. She then returned back home to her son, whom she had left with her mother. I'm done with Robert, but for Steve he will pay. I will take care of that, was her comment before we left the apartment. As for myself, it didn't hurt me what Robert did. What hurt me was the wrong I had done to Kathy. I was very, very sorry for this. We returned late in the night when everyone was already asleep, so I took Robert to task the next morning, first thing on the way to work. Ice cold and completely calm, I said to him, "You are the last miserable shit on earth, Robert. I give a shit if you fuck all over the place, but I entrusted you, Kathy, to help you with your shit residence permit. Do you have any idea how I'm really glad now that it hasn't worked out with the wedding?" Robert still tried to deny everything, but I fell into his words. "Unfortunately, I can't throw you out of my house anymore. Because of you, arsehole, I lost my own apartment, and I have to put up with that pigpen of your sister-in-law. But I swear I will do everything I can to find as quickly as possible an apartment for Kathy and me. Then you can suffocate in the mud with your sister-in-law." The same day, I took Kathy in my arms and begged her for forgiveness. "I'm so terribly sorry, Kathy. Please forgive me. I will make it up again. I promise you." Since that day, I touched nothing more in Marian's apartment. Instead, I took Kathy every day with me to a nice restaurant close by where we could eat clean and cheap. Again, I studied all the newspapers in search of housing. During my working hours, I made appointments to have a look at some apartments. After work, I drove up and down through Hamburg to visit homes. On weekends, I continued to work at night in the sky and slept daytime in the car, which was cold as ice. I did this until Alex, my colleague and friend from Sky, heard this from me and offered spontaneously to let me sleep during the day in her flat. Her offer to move completely in with her, at least until I found an apartment, I declined. Alex lived much further outside of Hamburg, and I learned by now that it was always a kinky thing with temporarily. After all, I had to create for Kathy and me a new home. Kathy had already far too often changed the school, which had to stop now. But first, Christmas was coming up, which was a rather sad celebration for us. Actually, none at all, because I worked 4 days on the piece in the Sky Club. Neville paid me for each day the double reward. Thus, I earned alone during the Christmas period and New Year's Eve 1,500 marks. It was ridiculous. On my account, the money amassed, but an apartment I couldn't find. At the beginning of 1991, it was still the same. Frustrated, I was once again just about to close the newspaper when my eyes wandered from poor rental ads down to real estate, and I spotted an offer of a two-room apartment in Norderstedt, a northern suburb of Hamburg, for the price of 65,000 marks. Why not? Damn it! If I couldn't find an apartment for rent, then I simply would buy one. I called the phone number and ended up with a bank from Harburg, which sold directly on behalf of the owner. This was even better. It would save me the broker fees. Thus began my new experience as property owner and the pros and cons of being one. After I saw it, I decided spontaneously for this small but solid apartment of a house in the green and friendly Norderstedt. For Kathy and me, this would be totally enough. I would sleep in the living room, leave the other spacious room and arrange it for her. The kitchen was small, but had space enough for a refrigerator, a cupboard, and a small kitchen table with 3 chairs. Sink and stove were already in place. The bathroom was equipped with solid tiles and a bathtub. What more did we need? I just needed to wait until the bank had sought inquiries about me if I had debt somewhere. A mere formality, because with my 2 jobs, of course, I was debt-free. A budget would be set up for me, and I learned quite a few new words as disagio and the like. The annual interest rate, percentage of the actual loan, repayment, and. I finally came up with a monthly payment of 600 marks, which I thoroughly could cope with, even if I eventually gave up the job in Sky. Somehow I had to consider it because I didn't intend to stay there forever. But meanwhile, I enjoyed the job, which was good fun for me. Although I was now 30 years old and sometimes already felt too old for the disco business. After the loan agreement was signed, the taking over of property had to be authenticated by court and by the Urban Land Registry Office, registered in the books. Very important for the German government, finally, the definition of the basic and real estate tax, which had to be paid before we moved in. At the end of February, after much running around, we finally moved in our own apartment. JC, Ralph, and the new DJ from Sky, and Robert helped us. Only after I had calmed down a little in the new apartment, I realized my menstruation had been absent, and I began to think about it closer. When was the last time I actually did have my period? Was it before Ghana? Or was it after? And why had I actually stopped taking the pill? I felt suddenly hot and cold at the same time. Immediately I went to a gynecologist, who undertook a urine test and examination. Then he informed me of what I already knew. I was pregnant. First off, I got a panic attack, and the doctor asked if I was having bigger personal problems. I reported I was separated from the father of the child, that I had a 12-year-old difficult daughter, and suddenly everything broke out of me. The situation with Marion, and that I saw no other choice but to buy an apartment, because I had no house. My double career burden, everything, and my tears were running over my face. Don't you have a family, parents, who could probably support a little? For a moment I looked at the doctor, then replied, "No, I have no one." Affected, he suggested, "In your situation, I would almost advise on abortion. You must, however, decide quickly. You are already in the 3rd month." "Do I have a few days?" I asked. "Only a few days, actually," this nice doctor answered, taking his time for me. Issuing the mother pass for me, he had to ask me of former pregnancies to complete it. Truthfully, I told him, 2 pregnancies. I already had an abortion earlier. This doctor was the only one to whom I confided this secret since so many years. Memories awoke which brought me even more to tears than previously. With the new mother pass, I finally left the practice and looked inside when I sat in the car. One birth, one miscarriage, I read. Complicated pregnancy because of problem situation and overload. 1,000 thoughts went through my head. What should I do? No way could I afford a child now. I finally had to pay off the apartment. When I fell asleep late that night, I dreamed at some point of my coffee-colored son, Tony's son. In the morning, I had not just an answer to all my questions, I also had made my decision. I would have this child. I was already sure it would be a boy. He was my son, the son I couldn't have years ago, or rather, not possessed the courage to have him. It was suddenly clear to me this was no coincidence. I just had used Robert, whom I didn't love, to be pregnant, which of course was not done deliberately. It happened automatically. I had forgotten one day to take the pill and stopped taking it at all, without really being aware of it. Robert was neither reliable nor truthful, but did I even want the father to the child by my side? For me, the answer was clear. This child I carried within me was the child I dreamt of for years, Tony's child. So it was predestined that I should get pregnant before my 30th birthday. My biological clock expired, and perhaps it was my last chance to have this son I always wanted. At the moment, I had absolutely no idea how I was going to manage with a second child, how I could continue with my 2 jobs, but until now I had always done everything. Well, there was much to do, and so I started doing it. It was still winter, bitterly cold. Thus I decided this day, which was for me a very special day, not to go to work and instead stay in bed. I continued with my thoughts and suddenly remembered the second night after my return from Ghana. This was the night we had made this child. I was convinced of it. I looked around in my living room and already planned how best to organize all to win space for a cot and the other things I needed for a baby. First, however, I informed the doctor I would have the child, who asked me doubtfully, "Are you really sure you can manage?" Of course I would. My boss was anything other than enthusiastic. "How do you think this will function?" I had by now exact ideas and explained to him, "As long as I can, I will continue working, and after the birth I'm back again as soon as possible." My boss pointed out this wouldn't be possible how I imagined it, because I was obliged by the law to stay at home 8 weeks before and 3 months after the birth. Nobody needs to know about it, right? I knew my boss needed me. The work was so extensive and complex, he couldn't just simply replace me. To make matters more complicated, if he found someone capable of the position, he had to make sure the person had a car. Without a car, it was almost impossible to reach my workplace in the Freeport. So we agreed on this unlawful basis. 5 months I would receive money from the insurance fund while officially staying at home, and my boss would continue to pay my salary, which, however, logically would be under the hand. Neville wasn't much happier than my boss, but I assured him equally to be as little absent as possible. "You're pregnant. You can't spend the nights in the club." He initially waved it off. To which I replied, "That's the point. I'm pregnant and not sick. The work here is fun for me, and what gives me fun cannot harm the child, right?" I argued, and hence was this also sorted out. More complicated became the situation with Robert. Since I took him to task, I slept on Marion's couch until we moved out and avoided him whenever I could. Nevertheless, he tried on me and begged me again and again for forgiveness. He voluntarily helped me with the move, came to visit us, and brought bags full of cakes, pies, and breads from the bakery. That impressed especially Kathy, who loved cake. It still surprised me a little that he was just too willing to forgive him everything and try to convince me likewise. Why don't you make up with Robert? Give him another chance. He has nothing to do with this Heike anymore. Secretly I thought, nothing to do? He has nothing but a child with her. On one of his visits, I told him I was pregnant. Horrified, he looked at me. That's not possible. You have to make an abortion. I have neither money nor time for a child. I need neither your money nor your time. In fact, I don't need you at all. I will not abort this child. It is my decision and my child. You have absolutely no say in this. Is that clear? If you don't like it, there's the door. Icy calm, I pointed to the door. Furious, he left my apartment and initially didn't come back. My God, everything I had been through before, but this time nobody would take my baby. The biggest fear, I had to submit the news to Kathy. She was so fixated and dominant with me. How would she take this news? Since we lived in Norderstedt, she had become quite bearable, and there were no bigger problems with her anymore. That her room permanently appeared as if a bomb had dropped in, I got used to, and found myself tidying up the clothes and other things she spread everywhere, carelessly, and washing the dirty dishes. I feared once again extreme scenes of jealousy if she had to share me with a baby. But she surprised me with her response. I certainly didn't expect it when I told her, as gently as possible, we would have a baby. A baby? That's great! Is it Robert's baby? Then it's a brown baby. Oh, how sweet! She exclaimed, delighted and enthusiastic. I had expected anything, but not this, and so I took her in my arms and silently hoped that this enthusiasm would last. As the next step, I wondered how I could find someone I could trust with my child while I worked. In any case, I didn't want to leave it to a coincidence and would also not wait with this until the last moment. The person who would look after my child I had to know well enough to trust 100%, and this meant I needed to know the person early. I advertised in the Hamburger Abendblatt, received numerous calls, and this caused as many personal conversations. Ultimately, I decided for Kirsten, a mother of 3 nearly grown children and a nanny of small children whose parents were working as I did. Among others, she also looked after colored children. Kirsten gave me a warm and loving impression. Not only the children were lovingly looked after by her, her apartment was also clean and tidy. Her own children had a very good relationship with her. 2-3 times a week I visited her from now on because I wanted not only to learn about but participate in their lives. Finally, she would be like a second mother for my child. Kirsten explained to me that the state paid for half of the allowance and I only needed to pay for the other half. At those times the state was generous anyway. As the owner of an apartment I lived in myself, I received such a high tax reduction I virtually didn't need to pay more taxes, and therefore my salary was paid gross for net. Yes, I had done it. From the bottom, I worked my way to the top, was completely independent, and on the best way even to get everything under control with the baby. My doctor was amazed at my next appointment. Instead of the impression of misery, like on the first visit, now a self-confident, radiant, expectant mother sat in front of him. I beamed even more when I heard for the first time the heartbeats of my child. At the first ultrasound examination he carried out now, he showed me his head, arms, legs, And, most important, the little penis. "Congratulations to your son," he was pleased with me. Again I wept tears, but this time tears of joy and emotion. "I knew it is a boy," I said, whereupon he corrected me. "You mean you wish this time it will be a boy?" I shook my head. "No, I knew it." The exams were completed. He told me the week of pregnancy I was in, and it didn't take much to convert back what I already knew, the day I conceived my son. My son. I loved him already with all my heart. I was finally reconciled with my past. In the following weeks, my nightmares would disappear, and this time for good. My life was almost going on as before. I did my work in the office and during the weekends, but with the difference that I was constantly cheerful and balanced. Nothing was too difficult for me, and I didn't suffer from the usual pregnancy complaints. In contrast to the fear of my boss that I probably would fail more often because of malaise, I missed not one single day and climbed the steep stairs of the huge ocean cruisers like the MV Queen Elizabeth I and II, up and down for creating repair reports in the shipyard of Blumenfors. Then one evening, Robert stood outside my door. "I made a mistake. If you want a child, then it shall be. I will not let you down." Somehow, everything happened automatically, as he visited us, initially, every day again, and then at some point stood with his baggage at the door. He was very helpful, made the shopping for us, joined me when I bought a small wardrobe with changing table, gave his share of money when I purchased all the baby equipment, and he was the one to buy an enchanting and practical stroller. I could later convert it into a toddler when my son would sit up and learn about his environment. It was also Robert who ran off to buy giant cups of ice cream if my insatiable appetite for ice cream overcame me. Sometimes I already sat up in the morning with a cup of ice cream, which Kathy and Robert visibly amused. Besides the ice cream cravings, I had plenty of appetite for sex, and so it was just serving me right that Robert was also at disposal in the evenings. It didn't seem to disturb him in any way that my size was getting ever bigger. On the contrary, it turned him on the more, and me too. One door was still open for me. My family should know about it now that I did exactly what I couldn't do years ago, with all its consequences. So I shared the happy news initially with my sister Elke, who responded very positively, even when I added where the father of my child came from. And about the icy silence of my parents after I had told them, she said, "Let them get used to the idea. You'll see, when the baby is born, they just have to see it the first time, they will be thrilled." As for the child's father, he is somehow part of it, and I suppose in some way they do have to realize this, if they want it or not. "You know what? Why don't you all come down over the weekend to visit?" Yes, why not? There was nothing to be ashamed of. But first, I had to fulfill my promise to Kathy to take her to the Kiel Week. There I was confronted with my past. I met Susie, but after the first joy of reunion, we realized we hardly had anything to say to each other anymore. Also Jude I met, who stared in astonishment at my now extensive form. He invited me for a coffee and told me he was divorced. His wife had found out about my visit to his apartment by prying neighbors, and retaliated by beginning a relationship with an Arab. After that, everything was over. Jude repeatedly had tried to get in touch with me, then learned I had moved to Hamburg. I proudly told him about my work in the disco I got to know through him. However, it made me a little sad when I remembered the old days and how much fun I had with the old gang. And now, life just went on and people changed. Only Annette and Hansi came to see me in Norderstedt. Yes, and Helga, who called me one day surprisingly, and since then visited me on regular basis once a week, since she also worked in Hamburg. The next weekend we actually followed the invitation of my sister and drove into the province. Elke and her husband were impressed with Robert. Elke had arranged it that my parents came for coffee. Polite but reserved, they shook hands with Robert. I was amused by them having to digest we had taken them by surprise, because Elke had not mentioned a single word before that we were also there. My mother stared at my extensive belly and asked, "And how to proceed now?" As if we were talking about the end of the world. Self-confident and with my head held high, I replied, "How should it proceed? After the birth, I will continue as before. I already have a nanny for my son. Everything is organized." Irritated, my mother asked, "But don't you want to marry?" I returned very relaxed the question, "What for? I don't see the slightest reason why I should marry." My mother now became very pale. I could see exactly what she thought. Her nightmare in form of her youngest daughter had returned. My father didn't talk much. He seemed to come to terms with the inevitable. The only comment he gave, looking at my belly, "How many months are you really?" "What? In the 7th month? Are you sure it is not going to be twins?" All burst out into laughter, except my mother. And so the atmosphere eased a little. I had the impression Robert had not really won Elke and Rainer for himself with his open and merry way, but also my father. Later, after my parents were gone, Elke and I amused ourselves about their faces while I casually counted how many bottles of beer Rainer consumed. 13. In contrast to Robert, who luckily didn't like drinking alcohol, I imagined such a man beside me in bed with a malodorous breath of alcohol. When I shook myself at the thought of it, Elke asked me if I was feeling cold. When I started with the pregnancy course and the gym, Robert accompanied me initially with eagerness and practiced the breathing exercises with me. For both of us this was new territory, because in Kathy's times nothing like it existed. But Robert's behavior didn't last long and changed completely. He turned repellent to me and wandered off with his thoughts many times. Each evening he arrived late from work and then listened dreamily with headphones to music cassettes which were unknown to me. The worst thing was when he was yelping loud with the music. With best will, but I couldn't call this singing. Kathy wanted to die laughing every time he started. Only I didn't think it was funny anymore, especially when I found out the reason for this ridiculous behavior. He was after a new co-worker in the bakery. She began to call in our house, and he confessed to me shortly thereafter he was seriously in love. To make matters worse, he had his dreadlocks cut off, and when he arrived with short cropped hair, what I found extremely ugly on him, he explained that his beloved had advised him to do so. My barrel ran over. I had enough. It was not jealousy, but because I now mutated to a super mommy who had the opinion that my son owned a right to his father, I would let no one dispute this right. Determined, I arrived one morning, pushing my giant belly before me, into the bakery, marched past the baking cases and the huge tables, took while passing one of the big knives, quite incidental, noted how suddenly everyone was dead silent, and all those people just stared in astonishment, as I found the person I was looking for, held the knife in front of her nose, and warned her in a sharp tone, "You know what happens if you don't leave the father of my child in peace?" Startled, she stammered, "I didn't know, but—" I wouldn't let her speak any further, and came dangerously close to her, with the knife and hissed, "Hands off!" turned around, threw the knife back on one of the tables, and walked out without looking left or right. After this I had peace. At least for a moment. Robert behaved like a small boy who had been given punishment, and it was almost ridiculous. It had long been clear to me that this wouldn't be the last time. For my part, I concentrated only on PM and his acrobatic exercises that he executed in my belly. Sometimes I was writhing in pain when he kicked me with full force, and we all found it too funny when he stretched one of his feet and pressed it against my stomach wall. Then my belly was changing into very strange shapes. In early August, though, I couldn't find anything funny any longer. My body had become so huge that my appearance was like that of a ball on legs. My own weight was turning into a terrible burden in this hot summer. Bending down, I could completely forget. Furthermore, water built up in my legs, and my feet were similar to those of an elephant. I used only flip-flops, for my other shoes didn't fit anymore, since a while now. But soon it would be over, and finally PM would be born. I had thought a long time about calling him Anthony. Finally decided not to do it. This child was not Anthony Jr. I also wanted to avoid that he would later suffer in school by his name. As I knew the Germans, they would make Anton of it, and certainly nobody deserved this. During those times a soul band existed whose music I liked very much, PM Dawn. This gave me the idea and inspiration. The question was, which names would fit to the initials? Philip? Yes. And M for Morris? Certainly not, it was a cigarette brand. So it should be Michael, pronounced like Michael Jackson, whom I still liked at that time. Yes, this was exactly the name for my son, PM, Philip Michael. My doctor determined his birth date between the 24th and 28th of August. During all this time, between me and Kathy, in exception of the normal friction, were no more serious confrontations. We had even somehow become allies. Kathy had realized long since that Robert played for me only a minor role. To her he wasn't a serious competition. In these hot summer nights, Kathy and I stood at the window, watching with amusement how Robert was following like a heated dog the new residents opposite at their window, and tried his luck with the two girls. I just shook my head. He can't leave it, eh? Friday, 23rd of August. I stood up with a strange pulling in my back, but thought nothing of it. Initially because I felt permanently uncomfortable in my back due to my weight. On the toilet, though, burst the amniotic sac. When Robert saw the mess, he panicked. Without paying more attention to him, I called my boss at home and told him I wouldn't come to work today and the next days. Robert was performing something like a nervous dance around me and put things together I didn't even need. If you're planning to pack my hospital bag, forget it. That's been done long since. I stopped him. Kathy was now up too, and both ran like scared chicken around me. Robert was about to call a taxi, but here I also stopped him. I want to have breakfast first, and put quietly my coffee on. Both looked at me without saying a word, as if they had a ghost in front of them. What? I don't have any contractions yet. So can I have breakfast or not? And I did, but soon after began the labor. The contractions were still light and easy to endure, but nothing could stop Robert now from calling a taxi. On the way to the hospital, he complained about the long way and bleated, "Couldn't you go to the hospital in Norderstedt?" And I bleated back, "No, I could not." When we finally arrived at the hospital, he saw why I had wanted to come here. After I had long before inspected some hospitals and maternity wards, I opted for this hospital in Henstedt-Ulzburg. It had one of the most modern maternity wards and a delivery room which assembled the suite of a five-star hotel, with a king-size bed decorated with numerous pillows to relax. Next door was an oversized bath, filled with well-tempered water. This also served to relax, and at the same time as labor place if one happened to choose for a water birth. Robert had long since agreed with me he would be present at birth. Now he marched around with me in the hallways. The contractions were stronger now and came in shorter intervals. After the examination, the midwife stated, however, it would still take a long time. If the amniotic sac had not opened, they would even have sent me back home. So I stayed, but Robert was advised to go home. It still took time, and they were going to let him know soon enough, so he had time to come back. The rest of the day dragged on slowly. The contractions came and went, then stopped completely. Over and over I was checked, ultrasound and heartbeats in between. I dozed a little, but was awakened again by renewed labor. It went on all night and half of the Saturday. I was already completely worn out. The contractions were becoming stronger now, but I still managed well with the breathing technique I had learned. But then they were becoming so strong I forgot everything and screamed loudly in pain. By evening I was examined again. The midwife suggested calling Robert because it was starting. The cervix was opened. Disappointed, I thought, it's starting. I thought I was in the middle of it and soon through with everything. The hours dragged on, and then I lost any feeling of time. Didn't even take too much notice of it when the midwife told me they couldn't reach Robert. Your daughter answered the call and gave us information that he was not at home. I didn't care, just wanted these infernal pains to stop, and screamed in pain. I begged for painkillers, but they gave me nothing. The midwife tried to reassure me it would not last long. Thus she was totally wrong. I screamed all night in pain and was completely weak. To my salvation came the doctor on duty Sunday morning, examined me, and after some intense discussion, of which I understood very little what it was about, I just knew it had to do with me. What frightened me, he came to the bed and explained, "Your gynecologist made a mistake by not writing the head circumference of the child in the mother pass. But also here, unfortunately, no one noticed that the head of your child is far too big, and therefore a natural birth is impossible. We will initiate an immediate cesarean birth." I didn't care for anything anymore, was only relieved that soon everything would be over. I couldn't take any more, even though the midwife had long since taken Robert's place, holding my hands and caressed them, reassuring me, wiping the sweat off my face with a cloth, again and again, encouraging me, and always reminding me to apply the breathing technique I had learned. It was over. I had neither the strength nor the will, and slid into the state of anesthesia